Hello debaters! If you watch the video on answering counterplans, you're going to notice some overlap between the way you answer a counterplan and the way you answer a critique. Both use the postal acronym to isolate the strategic methods of responding to the argument. But answering critiques can be a complex and tricky thing to do. Unlike counterplans, which exist in the hypothetical policy-making bubble, critiques infinitely expand the focus of the debate round far beyond the scope of any counterplan. So let's take a look at the many ways to answer a critique. Before we jump into the postal acronym, we need to deal with the framework presented as part of the critique. As you may recall, a framework is a debate about how the judge should prioritize and view the round and look at the critique when deciding the outcome of the round. If the negative team failed to offer a framework as part of the critique, which you can verify in cross-examination, then the first strategy is to argue that the affirmative plan already established a policymaker framework and that the goal of all participants is to consider the merits of the affirmative plan. That's your framework. And because the judge should view the round as a policymaker, then any philosophical questions about the nature of governance should be independent of the round. This argument doesn't mean that you don't need to debate the critique, but it does mean that the judge doesn't first need to decide whether capitalism, for example, is good or bad before deciding whether the affirmative plan, for example, is good or bad. If the negative team does offer a framework as part of their critique, then you'll need to address the framework as part of your answer to the critique. There are a few strategies that you can use to tackle the framework. The first strategy is to turn the framework the same way that you might turn a disadvantage. For example, if the framework says that we must consider the implications of terror talk before we engage in terror talk, then you could argue that since terrorism is a very real and empirically proven threat, talking about terrorism instead of responding to terrorism results in more terrorism. The second strategy for responding to a framework debate on the affirmative is to argue that the affirmative team reserves the right to set the framework in the 1AC. You as the affirmative team have the burden of proof and must affirm the resolution. And accepting the framework would require you to change your advocacy. For example, your evidence uses the word congressman, which links to a rhetoric critique, and the negative framework says that we must first evaluate our language before we can evaluate the affirmative plan. Accepting that framework would mean that you must debate and win the rhetorical and policy advocacies, while the negative only needed to win either advocacy. This places an unnecessary burden on you as the affirmative team. So defend your right as the affirmative team to establish the framework in the round. This strategy is becoming less common, so it should and only be used when it truly applies. The final strategy for responding to a framework debate on the affirmative is a framework permutation, and this one is my personal favorite. If you as the affirmative can hypothetically test the framework, and therefore the critique itself, by demonstrating a way in which the judge can simultaneously consider the merits of the critique while also passing the affirmative plan, there is no reason to reject the affirmative plan. This can be done by offering a perm in which you suggest the judge should consider the evils of capitalism while also voting for the plan. This reminds me of a joke. A public forum debater, a policy debater, and a K debater walk into a sundae bar and order an ice cream float. The public forum debater thinks nothing of the high fat and sodium contents and continues eating. The policy debater continues eating but realizes that it might be healthier in the future to order a salad and go for a walk. The K debater burns down the bar and never eats again. It's realistic and probably even preferable to adopt the merits of the critique without absolutely rejecting every instance of the plan and everything associated with it. By perming the framework, you are testing whether it is possible for the judge to simultaneously make a policy decision and a philosophical decision, even if those decisions aren't necessarily completely in agreement. The perm only needs to prove that it's possible to do both, and that's enough to prove that the framework alone isn't a reason to reject the affirmative. Speaking of perms, let's move on to our postal acronym to learn the other strategies for responding to critiques. The first P stands for permutations or perms. And in addition to perming the framework, you can also perm the critique itself. In a framework perm, you're testing whether it's possible to consider the framework of the critique and the policy framework at the same time. In a critique perm, the affirmative team tests whether it's possible to embrace the critique and the proposed affirmative plan at the same time. And in many instances, the answer is yes, particularly when the critique is focused on rhetoric or identity. If, for example, the affirmative team refers to the opposing team as guys, which links to a gendered language critique, that doesn't automatically mean that the judge must choose between general neutral language and the benefits of the affirmative plan. It is possible to embrace the critique and learn from it while also passing a plan that exists independent of the critique. Naturally, negative teams would have you believe that the only way to extinguish gendered language is to punish the team that uses such language. But this is certainly debatable. The same is true for identity critiques, in which the negative team claims that their exclusion from the activity is a reason enough to justify a rejection of the affirmative plan, and thus the only way to truly demonstrate acceptance and inclusion is to reward the negative team with a ballot. Again, it is possible to perm this idea and test whether inclusion could be fully realized without having to sacrifice the affirmative team. The second letter is O, which stands for offense. It is here where the affirmative team will debate the critique in much the same way as you debate a disad. Put defense and offense on the link, the impact, and the alternative. It's here where you can demonstrate the benefits of capitalism, for example, where you can show how your plan doesn't link to capitalism, but probably not both. You should read evidence that accurately and reasonably negates the claims made in each section of the critique. Also, if there's a framework argument around, you should add offense to the framework as well. The third letter is S, which stands for solvency, and this tends to be the most effective argument against the critique. In your 1AC, you introduced harms and solvency. You demonstrated the failings of the status quo and showed how your plan solved these failings and made life better for everyone. It's now time to leverage the benefits against the impacts of the critique. As always, you want to speak in hypothetical terms. Don't agree that the impacts of the critique will occur. Instead, weigh the benefits of solving for the harms in the 1AC against the weight of the impacts in the critique, while also demonstrating how the impacts of the critique won't actually ever happen. Naturally, the negative team will argue that the impacts of the critique are disastrous and guaranteed to happen, but make sure that they also disprove that the solvency of the 1AC. If you can show that the probability and time frame of the critique impacts are outweighed by the probability and time frame of the 1AC impacts, then you can demonstrate a reason to vote for the affirmative plan. The theory debate, represented by the letter T in our acronym, functions very much like a counterplan theory debate. Critiques can be conditional, unconditional, or dispositional. An affirmative team should lock the negative team into one of those statuses during the first cross-examination. Keep in mind that a conditional critique should not include a framework. Otherwise, that's pretty clear grounds for an abuse argument, since the framework presumes that this is already the most important issue, while the conditional status arguably negates that. The letter A in our acronym doesn't stand for add-on advantage this time, as it does for the acronym in the counterplans. Instead, the A in the critique acronym stands for the alternative. The affirmative team may want to spend a fair amount of time attacking the alternative, since it tends to be the weakest part of any critique. Here's why. The negative team wants you to believe that rejecting the affirmative plan solves for a non-unique impact. That's a paradoxical statement, and you shouldn't allow the negative team to try to straddle both horses. The negative team wants you to believe that rejecting the affirmative plan is some profound start to a prolific movement that will ultimately stop the impact from occurring. But this simply isn't the case with most alternatives. Yes, we can reject the plan because it's an example of what's wrong with the status quo, fine, but rejecting the plan doesn't prevent the impact from occurring. So the alternative doesn't solve for its own impacts. And if the alternative doesn't solve, then voting affirmative is clearly a better choice, because at least you allow the affirmative to gain the affirmative advantages. You weren't going to solve anyway. Here's an analogy to explain the last part. There are people in this world who don't vote in elections because they believe that all politicians are corrupt. And by symbolically withholding their vote, they believe they can start a chain reaction that eventually leads to nobody voting and thus ending the corruption in politics. This is similar to the critique in which the alternative is simply to reject the affirmative plan because it's an example of some corruption in the status quo. And while you can certainly decide to reject the voting process, just as you can reject the affirmative plan, there's really nothing about your rejection that solves the problem. Even on a purely symbolic level, you haven't accomplished anything, because doing nothing accomplishes nothing. And rejecting one thing doesn't solve for the things you haven't rejected. So the negative team that uses do nothing or reject the affirmative as an alternative to voting for the affirmative plan hasn't really done anything to solve the impacts of their own critique. And while they may say that rejecting the AF is symbolic, that doesn't mean they've proven that rejecting this affirmative will lead to a rejection of future affirmatives. Okay, so let's move on to our final letter, L, which stands for link. The affirmative team should pay special attention to the link presented in a critique. You have a few strategies when debating the link. The first strategy is to tie the link to the alternative and force our negative team to choose. In our previous example, I showed you how to demonstrate how your plan is not the only thing in the status quo that links to the impact. By forcing the negative to either prove that your plan uniquely links to the impact or that their alt doesn't solve, you can knock the critique off its foundation completely. The second strategy is to turn the link and demonstrate how your plan actually prevents the link. For example, if your plan proposes to use more drones and the critique claims that this increases securitization, you can turn the link by proving that drones are a less invasive way of collecting information, and this actually reduces the impact of securitization compared to the status quo. The third strategy is to debate the link between the affirmative plan and the impact, which is to say that your plan doesn't link to the critique. All right, that's a lot of information and a lot of strategies. Remember to debate the framework if it is presented, and remember to use the postal strategies to answer the critique. Most importantly, remember that this work needs to be done Sunday through Thursday. Once you're in the debate round, it is nearly impossible, let's say it is impossible, to effectively develop these strategies on the go. So give yourself options by working hard throughout the week. Now let's take a moment in conclusion to review the main concepts. Critique, framework permutation, offense, solvency, theory, alternative or alt, and the link. That's all for now. Good luck, debaters.